Hey, good to see everyone. We're continuing again with our class. Snehi, would you like to put up the some of the prayers?
Welcome back, Venerable George.
Thank you.
And hello, everyone. So nice to see so many people on a holiday weekend.
Yeah. Paul's there too, it looked like. Okay. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. Through the collections I create to listening through just listening to the Dharma, that means what we're doing now, rather than saying to the giving and so forth, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all migrating beings. I once asked Yangtze Rinpoche, did he think it was better to say, I go for refuge or I take refuge? He said, oh, you should say go for refuge, in his opinion. So that's what we have here. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. Supreme Assembly meaning not just the Sangha in general, the Hinayana Sangha, but Supreme Assembly means the assembly of Arya, either Arya beings or the Bodhisattva Sangha. Through the collections I create, through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all migrating beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. Through the collections I create, through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all migrating beings. And then when you imagine the mandala, you can imagine our world system with our sun and moon and the world, maybe the other continents, there are differing views amongst even modern scholars. Sometimes people say the southern continent is our Earth and the other continents are Venus, and some of the others, depending on the colors. Or you can say, as in the ancient tradition, the India being Jambudvipa, the southern continent, and the north of that, and continents north and southeast and west of that. But you imagine the whole sort of solar system transformed into a Buddha land, all the things that you have connection with. By offering this ground, anointed with perfume and strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, the four continents, the sun and the moon, visualized as a Buddha realm, may all migrators enjoy a pure realm. O holy and perfect, pure Lama, from the clouds of compassion that form in the skies of your Dharmakaya wisdom, please release a rain of vast and profound Dharma, precisely in accordance with the needs of those to be trained. So that's reminding us that the Dharmakaya, the Buddha's Dharmakaya, like a vast sky, spontaneously, without effort, without thought, can send down blessings like a rain of vast and profound Dharma in accordance with just what people need at that time, in accordance with the needs of those to be trained. Idam Guru Radna Mandalakam Niryatayami. So let's spend a moment trying to calm our minds, enhance our motivation to sit comfortably, spine erect, eyes partially closed, sort of looking down. Relax your body. Find a good position. Relax your body, relax your mind. Remember, you don't have to think of anything else right now. And notice the respiration in and out. Once you've noticed it, you can keep it in your memory, in your mindfulness. Mindfulness is a mental factor that takes as its object in something which has already been realized. So we first realize the breathing, we observe it. Then once you've got that, you hold it in mind. To the exclusion of everything else. If you hold carefully to the mindfulness of the breathing, you hold that mindfulness strongly, other appearances to the mind can begin to subside. Especially the thinking process, plans about the future, memories of the past, observations about the present, so forth. Add a little wisdom, thinking, recognizing when you're breathing out and when you're breathing in. And keep the continuity such that even when the direction of the breath is changing, you don't let go of that mindfulness. Remember to relax your body continually. Then follow one breath in as though it's going up your nostrils to the crown of your head, down to your throat, to your heart chakra. And let go of mindfulness of the breathing, just watching your mental consciousness. Which we try to recognize here, not just the consciousness itself, but its conventional nature of being free of any obstruction to the arisal of thoughts, free of any obstruction to the disappearing of those thoughts absorbing back into the consciousness, space-like consciousness. all the methods we talked about over different courses in the teachings about this practice that's called the Mahamudra. Simply noticing the space between thoughts, if you're overcome by them, focusing on that. Even when the thoughts are present, or emotions, plans, memories, recognizing that the very presence implies a spaciousness of mind within which they're arising. Just transferring your attention away from the objective thought to the subjective mind within which it's arising. It's conventional clear light nature of the mind. Which is also called our developmental Buddha nature. Like the little train of the children's bedtime stories. I think I can. I can, because I can eliminate the faults from my mind. Because they are not part and parcel of this clear light nature. They are just like cloud-like appearances. And I can develop within my mind all of the sublime qualities of the Buddhist path: renunciation, compassion, bodhicitta, the right view of emptiness. And recalling that this situation right now, recognizing this, is due to the fact that we have a life of leisure and endowment, which we created the cause for in many previous lives through practice of morality and charity and prayer and so forth, bodhicitta motivation, with which this life of leisure and endowment we can use for multiplicity of purposes. We can become rich and famous and powerful and satisfy try to satisfy our ego, or we can recognize that this life is one in which we can practice the Dharma. We don't need anything else. We don't need a bigger amount of money or a better house or better companions or praise. We have everything we need with a life of leisure and endowment to practice the Dharma, to achieve the great purpose of either liberation from cyclic existence or enlightenment. Or even if we don't achieve those goals this life, to leave imprints to be able to achieve them in the future by meditating on compassion, renunciation, developing the understanding of emptiness. Why would we do so? From the point of view of liberation, we would do so in order to get out of samsara for ourselves. From the point of view of Mahayana, having cultivated an understanding that all sentient beings have been our mother, having an affection for them, and going further, recognizing their great preciousness, even when they've been stranger or enemy. We can develop an empathy and compassion for them and recognize the best way to use this life of leisure and endowment is to work to achieve enlightenment for ourselves, fulfill our own aim, from which position we can effortlessly and spontaneously, without error, lead all sentient beings out of suffering, lead them into the stable, everlasting happiness of enlightenment themselves. With that kind of motivation, whatever you do during the day, always having that goal of my achieving enlightenment for the sake of sentient beings as your ultimate goal. In the same way, right now, we're going to be listening, contemplating, and meditating on the material of Lama Tsongkhapa's great commentary, particularly talking both about the practices of ordinary beings before reaching the state of an Arya, the three practices of compassion, view of non-duality, and bodhicitta. Eventually, as we reach the higher bhumis, the sixth bhumi and beyond, the Arya bhumis, where you have a direct realization of emptiness. So think, I'm going to listen to the teachings in order to achieve this state of enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings. And then bringing your attention back to the present. How are we doing? So, any questions, observations? So you can say observations about the meditations or questions that are left over from last time. Anyone have anything? How many people had a chance to read the article? Richard, okay. Ron. Kristen, did you put your hand up there for a second? Yeah. Okay, good number of people. Shankar, you read?
I kind of scanned it when you sent it to me originally, but I have to read it. For
Yeah, you have to read it again, especially, Stephen, did you get a chance to read it? Did you see it?
Yes, Venerable George, I did scan it. I could read the first part and the last part.
You scanned it on your scanner, or you scanned it with your eyes and mind?
With my eyes.
Oh, okay. Jennifer, did you get a chance? Okay. Paul?
Yeah, I read it through, George.
Okay, good. Violet, did you see? No, okay. Do you know the article I'm talking about? Okay, so.
I read the end, so I found out who did it.
Who did it? What do you mean, who did it?
It's the butler, you know that.
Oh, okay, I see. Diana, did you get a chance to read?
I read the first half and I haven't finished it yet.
Okay, so I think it may give you some encouragement because it is a scholarly article. Jeremy Mannheim is, I mentioned before, is a good friend of mine, a scholar who had been at the dialectic school for many years, now is working on his PhD at University of Wisconsin under John Dunn and so forth. And it just so happened that that course, the topic that he wrote the paper on, it was just about what we're about to be talking about today and so forth. So, Ida, you have a question or comment?
Well, Venerable Josh, what do you think? Let me put this in words. The objectless compassion is a separate mental state or consciousness, then emptiness, then realizing emptiness. I don't know. For me, that would mean that if you don't have an understanding of emptiness, then it's just regular or conventional compassion. That you do need to have an understanding of emptiness for that compassion to be the seed of that altruistic mind with the with that intention. So I believe I don't think Tsong is quite correct in that. I think you also you
okay.
need.
That's good. That's good. I like to have
altruistic.
people challenging Lama Tsongkhapa. That's good. Yeah. Okay.
It's
So
not
you
a
don't
separate
need-
mental
you don't
state.
need-
I think.
You
Go
don't
ahead.
need. Yeah, I'm sorry. You don't need the objectless compassion to generate bodhicitta. It's possible to generate bodhicitta just with the ordinary great compassion, the first one. Okay, the compassion, great compassion, observing sentient beings. So
Well,
if your mind and on the basis of that, you can generate bodhicitta, conventional bodhicitta.
but that's conventional bodhicitta. I still believe that you have to have an understanding of emptiness to realize what is the suffering of sentient beings, and that creates that altruistic mind of compassion.
I don't
great
think so.
compassion. But
I don't think so. You don't need to understand emptiness to have compassion observing sentient beings, because what you're observing is sentient beings who are suffering. And when we talk about suffering, we talk about suffering of suffering, changeable suffering, and pervasive suffering generally. You have compassion, you can have compassion for them, wishing that they would be free of that, and even taking the motive that you yourself will bring that about. That's when we talk about Mahayana great compassion. What that compassion, though, can be enhanced if you also have realized, say, for instance, subtle impermanence. So as the text we're going to be reading again today, we talk about compassion observing phenomena. That means in addition to observing sentient beings who are suffering, you have previously realized impermanence, subtle impermanence. And so there is an appearance to your mind of the sentient beings as being qualified by being impermanent. So that can affect your compassion more than just the compassion observing sentient beings where you don't have any other realization. I had mentioned at the very beginning how that meant that you are not so distraught when you see sentient beings suffering, because you know that it will come to an end, that it's impermanent and so forth. You don't have kind of idiot compassion, but the text draws out that that kind of understanding, you have a greater compassion for sentient beings because they are oblivious of that momentary change. Everything is so important to them, and so they're suffering even more. Then with the objectless compassion, if you've realized emptiness previous to your development, that is to say, in any one meditation session, when you're meditating on compassion, if you have within your mind a fresh realization of emptiness, whether it doesn't have to be direct, it could be even conceptual. When you're observing sentient beings, they are qualified to your mind. They are distinguished, let's say, by the fact that they are empty of inherent existence. And they themselves are oblivious of that fact. They are oblivious. They don't know that they're empty of inherent existence. And so they are an object of even greater compassion. So that when we talk about these three kinds of compassion observing sentient beings, which means mere sentient beings without being qualified as impermanent or empty of inherent existence. And the compassion observing phenomena means observing sentient beings qualified by being impermanent or even qualified by being empty of being self-supporting, substantially existent. As the text will mention, you have a greater kind of compassion for them. I remember, I think I told you before, Geshe Tekchok used to give this example. If you're on the bus, and I tried this on the bus, looking at other people and recognizing whatever they're doing. Most of the time nowadays, especially in the last decade, everyone is looking at their cell phone, right? On the bus or the train or whatever. But they might be reading or looking out the window or arguing or crying or laughing or whatever, but they are obviously oblivious of the fact of their actual state of being impermanent, of being empty of self-supporting substantial existence, oblivious of being the fact that they are empty of inherited existence. And so you can recognize how that becomes a cause of their generating, fascination with the present, just the appearance of the present, that's all that dominates their lives. We're even people who are, quote, intellectuals who are not familiar with these deeper, aspects of wisdom. You could call them all meat and potato people. They just want to have something, let's say on one level, they want to watch the game, the football game, and eat Cheetos and drink beer and so forth, or they have their own kind of intellectual kind of football game, politics or power or, becoming wealthy and so forth, stock market. They have their own kind of games, oblivious of the momentary impermanence and so forth. So that's mainly what we're talking about. You don't need to have compassion observing the, objectless compassion. You don't need to have that to generate bodhicitta. If you do, you can generate bodhicitta even more quickly. So anyway, that's coming. So let me continue on, unless someone else has another question. How are we doing? Okay, so I finished, and now the place where we're beginning is, it says, the commentary explains that the three types of compassion are to be distinguished not on the basis of their cognitive aspects, but on the basis of their focal objects. Who knows what in the text? What page is that?
Page 51.
Page
Venerable George.
51. Okay. Thank you, Paul. And so for the aspect of all three is the wish for sentient beings to be free of suffering. So what's the point here? When it says the commentary, that means Chandrakirti's auto commentary to his verses, right? So the Karikas are very, very brief, but he wrote extensive commentary to that, which does exist in Sanskrit, sort of recently available, if anyone's interested. Also, we have it in Tibetan and so forth. So the commentary, Chandrakirti's commentary to the verses say that these three types of compassion are to be distinguished not on the basis of their cognitive aspects, but on the basis of their focal objects. So another way of saying this is, rather than saying cognitive aspects, but on the basis of their focal objects. Usually in Tibetan, we say aspect is the Tibetan word nampa. And what he's translating as focal objects here means referent. We say in Tibetan, mikpa means the referent. So what does that mean? Say, for instance, if you observe or refer to the referent object of sentient beings are your referent object. That's what you're referring to. Or you say you're referring to yourself. That's your focal object. The way you think about that is the aspect. That is that, generally with ignorance, when you think about yourself, the aspect, your focal object is yourself. And the aspect, one of the aspects is that you may be concentrating on or drawing from that observation is that the person is inherently existent. With wisdom, you observe the conventional self. That's your focal object. And the aspect is that it is empty of inherent existence. When we talk about compassion rather than wisdom, so you're observing your focal object as sentient beings, and what your conclusion is in observing them, what the aspect in which you're thinking of them is that they be free from suffering. Does that make sense? We talk about referent and aspect. Here he calls it cognitive aspect. He's adding an extra qualifying term there. And focal object, you can call it referent object or object of observation. So, like say, for instance, as I look at the tree outside my window right now, the focal object, referent object of observation is the tree, or let's say more particularly the leaves. And the aspect that my eye consciousness is drawing from that is the color green. Okay, so that you can have you can observe something and have different kind of aspects depending on how your mind is approaching that. Making sense so far? Venerable Palma, what do you think? Does that make sense? Venerable Palma, are you there?
I had my book on top of the computer, so it took a minute to get my button.
Oh, okay. No.
To be honest, I'm thinking about it, and in some ways it makes a little bit of sense, but in some other ways, no.
Okay. In which way not?
Well, my mind is kind of foggy since I had a stroke, so I can't even tell you.
Okay, that's fair enough. Okay, that's how my mind usually is. Okay, good. So let's go a little bit further. We'll go back. So we're talking about two things here. When we talk about these three kinds of compassion, there are not to be differentiated or distinguished on the basis of their aspects. That is, one of them, the aspect the commentary explains that the three types of compassion are to be distinguished not on the basis of their cognitive aspects, but on the basis of their focal objects. For the aspect of all three is the wish for sentient beings to be free from suffering. When you're observing sentient beings in all three of these compassions, the compassion observing mere sentient beings, the compassion observing phenomena, the compassion, the objectless compassion, your focal object or your object of observation is sentient beings, but the aspect that you are thinking about at that point is that they be free of suffering. Say, for instance, if you talk about the objectless compassion, you're not observing the sentient beings in this case and having an aspect of them being empty of inherent existence. That would be a meditation on emptiness, right? Here you're meditating on compassion. I'm going to go a little bit further. As such, the three are also similar in taking sentient beings as their object of focus. For instance, in the context of the first compassion, Chandrakirti's auto-commentary says, having become compassionate for migrating beings, while in the context of the latter two compassions, observing phenomena and objectless compassion, it states fleeting migrating beings or transmigrating beings. So they present sentient beings to be their object of focus, their objects of observation, their referent object. So all three of them are referring to sentient beings. All three of them have the same aspect of wanting sentient beings to be free of suffering. Therefore, compassion that takes phenomenal reality or takes phenomena as its object does not merely take sentient beings as its object. It takes as its object sentient beings who are disintegrating on a moment-by-moment basis. Thus, it focuses on sentient beings qualified by impermanence in the sense of their momentariness. Does that make sense? Rachel, what do you think? Have you had a chance to read that, think about that?
No, Venerable George, but as you're saying it, it makes sense that it's sort of like they're more refined. So you're taking sentient beings as the object for all three, but you're only taking a subset of or a way of looking at sentient beings in different ways for each three of the three types.
So when it says distinguished by or qualified by being impermanent or qualified by being empty of an inherent existence for the second and third compassions, it doesn't mean that at that moment that compassion is realizing impermanence, or that at that moment that compassion is realizing emptiness. It means that you had in your mind a fresh realization of impermanence or emptiness, and that's affecting your observation, so that there's still your focal object is still sentient beings, but in one case, say as it's influenced or affected by or grasped by a realization of impermanence. What that means is that the sentient beings may seem kind of like the ripples on a lake, in the root verse that he's talking about. Sort of, you're aware of the fact that they're changing. And in the case of being held by or affected by the realization of emptiness, you have a separate realization of emptiness, which is not manifest now, but that has influenced your mind such that the sentient beings who you're focusing on, your objects of observation, appear kind of like a mirage. You know, like when we talk about having realized emptiness, when we talk about space-like meditation on emptiness, right? Have you heard that expression? Space-like meditation on emptiness. Summer, have you heard that expression? Space-like meditation. So that'd be like meditative equipoise on emptiness. Nothing else is appearing. When you arise from that meditative equipoise on emptiness, phenomena appear again. The trees, the fences, the cars, your kitchen, your coffee, and so forth. But having been influenced by that realization, we call that, while that realization of emptiness hasn't completely been forgotten, we say that post-meditation experience is the illusion-like meditation on phenomena. They look like illusions or like mirages. There's kind of a memory of that realization that you had that's not of them being empty, that's not completely degenerated. How are we doing? Making sense? Mikhail, making sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I just understood that if I'm right, the aspect is the same for the three compassions,
right?
But the focal object has a similarity in that they are all observing sentient beings, but they are qualified differently in the three types of compassion.
Nice. Yeah, good synthesis. Yeah, yeah.
You-
So the all three aspects are the same. You want sentient beings to be free of suffering. That's what compassion means, right? So therefore, compassion that takes phenomenal reality as its object does not merely take sentient beings as its object, it takes as its object sentient beings who are disintegrating on a moment-by-moment basis. Thus, it focuses on sentient beings qualified by impermanence in the sense of their momentariness. Now, some of the, if you were to have read that article, or if you will read that article, make note, some of the scholars, like say, for instance, the textbook writers of Sarah J. and of Drabung monasteries, Jason Chogi Gelson and Panchen Sonam Drakpa and so forth, they kind of disagree a little bit with Lama Tsongkhapa. So whoever had said, was it Ida or someone said, I didn't agree with that. So maybe you have some, some companions. They said that it is directly held by a realization of impermanence, or directly held by a realization of emptiness of those two later compassions. So that would mean that there would have to be two mental consciousnesses. Now, generally, we say there's just one mental consciousness, right? You don't have two mental consciousnesses. But it comes up in situations like this that almost seems like there could be two streams of mental consciousness, because generally, when we studied mind and mental factors, or if you haven't studied that subject, be aware that generally there's a famous statement that the Buddha made that any one consciousness has only one referent, one focal object, and one aspect. So if the compassion observing sentient beings qualified by being empty, the objectless compassion, if it had a direct realization of emptiness, that would be its aspect. it would be not just observing sentient beings, wanting them to be free of suffering, but observing sentient beings realizing that they are empty of inherent existence. So according to some of the other authors, let's say, coming after Lama Tsongkhapa, and maybe even before, they posited the possibility of having two streams of mental consciousness. One of them is realizing the sentient beings of empty of inherent existence. That's its aspect. The other one is observing sentient beings, and its aspect is wanting them to be free of suffering. So here in Lama Tsongkhapa's text, it never says directly held by the realization of emptiness, or directly held by the realization of impermanence. It just says affected by or held by. And the implication is that, as I said before, you had a previous realization of emptiness or previous realization of impermanence, and that affects your mind. So that when you're observing sentient beings, they have this kind of appearance as being impermanent or empty. Shankar, what do you think?
I think you're right, but I had a question.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah.
So when I'm sleeping, when my mental consciousness is in the mode of sleep, or is the aspect then sleep?
No. Say if, for instance, if you're in a dream, there are different kinds of sleep, right? There's deep sleep when it was almost like just blackness. But when you have REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, that's usually associated with dreaming, right? So when you're dreaming, you may dream of your college examination test room, and the aspect is one of fear. You're afraid that you're taking the final exam and you don't know anything. You read the questions, you don't know anything. So you can have, or you can be observing a beautiful man or woman in your dream. Say if it's sort of like some kind of extension of a daydream or something like that, and the aspect of that would be that they are attractive. So that could give rise in your dream to attachment and so forth, or you can have a dream of food, and the aspect of that dream could be that it tastes good. Even in a dream, you can imagine that something has a taste. Lama Yeshe used to say that when he was at Sarah J, and they didn't have very much to eat, they would have a little bit of sampa that they would mix with dirt even, or sawdust, and they would put with their tea to eat. They didn't have much food, and he would dream of a juicy piece of meat, or a big lump of butter or something like that. And when he woke up, he would feel having some kind of satisfaction from that dream, having eaten that. Rachel, what are you thinking?
Well, Venerable George, I hope I'm not going too far off, but when we're talking about mind and mental factors, we're talking about our ordinary mind, or are we talking about the mind that can be transformed into the mind of the Buddha, where wouldn't the Buddha be able to have both of these streams in simultaneously?
Yeah. So for ordinary beings, first of all, we can only observe either conventional truth directly or ultimate truth directly at one time. We can't have a direct realization of both at one time. They're different aspects. But a Buddha's mind goes beyond that. It can know all phenomena and all aspects at the same time. In fact, the way that the Tibetans translate, one of the ways that we translate omniscience is Nampa Tamche Kempa. Nampa means aspect, Tamche means all, Kempa means knowing. Knowing all aspects of all phenomena at the same time. So the Buddha's mind is an exception. It can know multiple aspects. It can know sentient beings are suffering. It can know that they are impermanent. It can know that they are empty of inherent existence, all at the same time. So that may be origin of why some scholars say that ordinary beings can have two mental consciousnesses at the same time. One that's realizing sentient beings are suffering, one that's realizing sentient beings are empty of inherent existence, not like the Buddha that knows all aspects at the same time. So I don't have my own understanding of Lama Tsongkhapa is that in this text, he does not say anything that indicates that that these compassions are directly held by realization of impermanence or realization of emptiness. That is to say, directly held means that that there are two aspects at the same time. There's an ordinary compassion and there's a realization of emptiness happening in two mind streams at the same time. Lama Tsongkhapa doesn't say that here, but some of the textbook writers, the Yikcha, we say Yikcha in the Tibetan monasteries, they do say for them that there must be this kind of being directly held. So there are two consciousnesses. Who is it, Ida? Yeah, Ida, there you go.
Venerable, could it be one mind stream and two mental factors? Could those be two mental factors?
Right, but as we learned in the study of mind and awareness, Lorig, any mind, let's say primary mind, has many mental factors that can be simultaneous. That's okay. But those mental factors have to have the same referent or focal object, and they have to have the same aspect as the primary mind and as each other. Okay? It can't be that they are observing different objects. You know, that let's say the main mind is observing sentient beings and the mental factor is observing, trees or something else. They have to have the same focal object, same referent object, same object of observation, and they have to have the same aspect. They have to be realizing the same thing, that sentient beings are suffering, or that the aspect of wanting sentient beings to be free of suffering, or in the case of realizing emptiness, that sentient beings are empty of inherent existence. Those are two different aspects. They would not occur within a main mind or its mental factors at the same time. They all have to have the same focal object, referent object, and they all have to have the same aspect, or what does he call cognitive aspect. Okay. Paul, you've heard this before, right? Did you have a chance to study Lorig?
Oh yeah, no, we did a lot of low Rick back in the day. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, Ashley, I missed you before. So Sean, what's your thought?
So when he was saying fleeting migratory or transmigratory beings, that's just another way of saying this momentariness or impermanence in the sense of their momentariness.
Right. So one interpretation would be that there are two consciousnesses, one that's observing sentient beings, wanting them to be free of suffering, and one that is realizing them as fleeting or momentary, transitory. But Lama Tsongkhapa, the way that one can understand Lama Tsongkhapa here, just from his text, without adding any of these other theories, is that that mind that's observing sentient beings is affected by your previous realization of their fleeting nature, of their impermanent nature, of their transitory nature, momentary nature. That is, that you've realized that they're impermanent in the subtle, in terms of subtle impermanence, right? They're changing moment by moment. Your mind is affected by that. And as you're observing them, it's almost as though that affects how they appear to you as being somehow kind of wavering, like when it's talking about the example of the ripples on a lake. Mary Ellen?
Is that part of the disintegratedness of the not realization or cognitive realization that affects the mind in that way?
Well, say, for instance, you can be aware of the fact that things are changing moment by moment, or you cannot be aware of that. For instance, when we look at, our bowl of ice cream in front, it appears to be permanent. It doesn't appear to be changing moment by moment. And because of that, our minds have become accustomed to what's called permanent grasping. In the same way that phenomena appear to be inherently existing, they appear that way, and that strengthens our grasping, our belief in that as true, our belief that things are inherently existing. In this case, if you have the second or third kind of compassion observing phenomena, or objectless compassion, you could say the compassion observing the non-referential. There's different ways you can translate that. If you have just one consciousness, as Lama Tsongkhapa is implying here, it's as though it is affected by or qualified by sentient beings somehow appearing in your observation of them as being momentary, or seemingly appearing to be mirage-like or illusion-like in the compassion observing the non-referential, or what do we say, objectless compassion. Okay, so it's a subtle point. You can see if you read that article later, those who have not yet read it, on the basis of what we're talking about now, you can start to see there are different views of the scholars, especially the Sakya scholars on this subject. But all of them are still talking about they accept these three kinds of compassion. Okay. Let me go a little bit further. Within the awareness that ascertains sentient beings to be disintegrating moment by moment, within the awareness that ascertains sentient beings to be disintegrating moment by moment, the apprehension of sentient beings as permanent, unitary, and autonomous ceases. So what does that mean? That means if you have a mind that realizes sentient beings are impermanent, realizes the subtle impermanence of sentient beings, that's a different one. That's not the compassion that observes phenomena, according to Lama Tsongkhapa. This is talking about what has preceded that compassion that observes phenomena. It is that you've realized that sentient beings are He says disintegrating moment by moment, that they are momentarily changing, right? One moment of sentient being appears so much like the last moment that you don't notice the difference. But if you have realized that, you are aware of the fact that they're changing moment by moment, even though they don't appear to be changing moment by moment. So within that awareness, the apprehension of sentient beings as being permanent, partless, or as he says, unitary, and independent, or as he says, autonomous ceases. So what are those three factors? Do anyone know? Sentient beings as being permanent, partless, and independent is called the what?
That's the course, course, subtle selflessness, right?
Let's call this the coarse selflessness.
Oh
According
yes, course
to the
selflessness.
lower tenets.
Yeah.
So according to like the Hinayana tenets, Shravakas, Pratika Buddhists, this idea that sentient beings are permanent, partless, and independent is something that people grasp to. Permanent, here he says permanent, unitary. Unitary means just one unit, not partless. You know, they're permanent, so unitary means partless, not having parts. It's just like just one unit. And autonomous means independent. So this is this comes from the Vedic teachings, let's say the Hindu teachings. Maybe the Samkhya's, is it, Paul? I can't remember, that posit that the being is permanent, it's sort of eternal, is partless, just like, you know, some kind of thing that's independent of the aggregates. There's some kind of soul that's out there that's permanent, say eternal, is partless, so it doesn't have anything to do with the aggregates, and is independent. You know, it has its own kind of independence. And you could say independent of the aggregates also. But that is, from a Buddhist point of view, that view is not something that we have naturally. It's not an innate kind of ignorance. So for the Mahayana schools, that kind of view of being permanent, partless, and independent is not considered to be one of the fundamental kinds of ignorance, because it's not innate. It doesn't arise. It only arises when you've been taught the possibility that the person is permanent, partless, and independent, like say from having studied the Hindu scriptures or the Vedic scriptures. So at any rate, it says, within the awareness that ascertains sentient beings to be momentarily disintegrating moment by moment, the apprehension of sentient beings as being permanent, unitary, and autonomous ceases. So that wrong view that they're permanent, partless, and independent can't exist if you've if an awareness has ascertained sentient beings to be impermanent. One is then able to ascertain the absence of sentient beings that possess a reality separate from their aggregates. What does this mean? So generally, we can have a misconception that the self kind of exists independent of the aggregates, independent of your body and mind, like say in the Christian tradition, right? The soul, even if the aggregates are destroyed, the soul continues as though the soul is independent of the aggregates, right? Don, making sense? Don Isaacson? Yeah. So one is then able to ascertain the absence of sentient beings that possess a reality separate from their aggregates. a quote Geshe Chuni in Singapore, who's been teaching also this. He said, once you understand that sentient beings are impermanent, that they are not permanent, you understand that there is no permanent sentient being separate from the aggregates. Right? If they're not permanent, there's no permanent sentient being separate than the aggregates. So it overcomes this wrong view from the tenets of the Hindu tradition that they're permanent, partless, and independent of the aggregates. And Geshe Chuni said this point is a little bit difficult to understand. Paul, what do you think?
Well, I was just going to ask, does that mean that the first type of compassion is taking sentient beings as their objects as if they are permanent?
No, not necessarily, because, and in fact, it will come up later. Say, for instance, in the course that we did here a little bit earlier, some of you participated, the practice of emptiness, the text by the fifth Dalai Lama. The fifth Dalai Lama pointed out that when we observe, even though in general it's possible for ordinary beings who have not realized emptiness, to grasp at things as being inherently existent, right? Right? They haven't realized emptiness, so they do have that mind grasping to phenomena as inherently existent, but they don't always grasp at phenomena as being inherently existent. Say, for instance, you're eating your cereal in the morning and your friend asks, where's the sugar, where's the milk? And you just say, it's in the refrigerator. You're not grasping at that moment on the milk as being inherently existent. There are many instances of this. Same thing with impermanence. Even though in fact, the text will say this explicitly, even though you've realized a vase or pot, even though you haven't realized that it's impermanent, you do have in your mind permanent grasping. So in some circumstances, you can grasp at a pot as being, or a vase as being permanent. You don't always grasp at that. You can just have a neutral kind of state of mind that refers to the pot without being affected by being permanent or impermanent. So here, the person observing sentient beings, even though if you talk about that one in the mind stream of someone who's not realized subtle impermanence, they do have in their mind stream grasping at permanence. But when they think about sentient beings, that's not necessarily always there. You're not always grasping at them as being permanent. Does that make sense, Paul?
Yeah, so it sounds like that first kind is just sort of taking sentient beings in that neutral sort of sense. Is that what you're saying?
It could be even that first one could be one in which you were affected by grasping at permanence, but that grasping at permanence, sentient beings as being permanent, won't be simultaneous with that. That would require also a second mental consciousness, one that has the aspect that sentient beings wishing them to be free of suffering, and one that is grasping at them at being permanent. It could be that your mind is affected by that, and that could be the first kind of compassion, or it can be that the first kind of compassion is one in which you were affected by, that you are not affected by that you're just holding them neutral without realizing that they're impermanent. Anyway, that will come up explicitly in a little bit further.
Oh, thank you, George.
Okay, so this this point is supposed to be a little bit difficult. One is then able to ascertain the absence of sentient beings that possess a reality separate from their aggregates. If you've realized that they're impermanent, to understand sentient beings to be designated upon the mere collection of aggregates, it sort of follows from realizing that they are impermanent in the subtle sense, that they're disintegrating moment by moment. You also understand the sentient beings to be designated upon the mere collection of aggregates, and to ascertain that sentient beings designated upon mere phenomenal reality, like the aggregates, come to be the objects of one's compassion. So I'll ask you to think about this in the next week. This little section, why that's the case, that simply having realized sentient beings are impermanent, you also realize that they are not, they don't possess a reality separate from their aggregates. They are not independent of the aggregates. When you talk about this threefold sense of the Hindu, the Vedic tradition, that they're permanent, partless, and independent, you realize that they're not permanent because you realize their impermanence. You realize that they are not independent of the aggregates. And you realize that sentient beings are imputed or designated upon the mere collection of the aggregates. So this is a subtle point. It doesn't go, there's no commentary here, but as Geshe Chuni has said in Singapore recently, I don't know, Violet, are you listening to Geshe Chuni's teachings there? Yeah, so he mentioned that this is, this how this comes about, how this factor comes about is not easy. Okay, let's go continue. Thus, it is referred to as taking phenomena or phenomenal reality as its object. So this is the second kind of compassion. The first compassion is observing mere sentient beings, not qualified by anything, just wanting them to be free of suffering. The second one, compassion observing phenomena, means you still observe sentient beings, want them to be free of suffering, but those sentient beings are qualified by being momentarily changing, momentarily impermanent, subtle, qualified by subtle impermanence. And as a result of that, you also know that they are empty of being self-supporting, substantially existent. So when the phrase taking phenomenal reality as this object is used for taking sentient beings merely designated upon their phenomenal reality, the modifier mere is left implicit. Or you can say, Hopkins translates that as, therefore giving the name observation of phenomena to observation of sentient beings who are designated to mere phenomena is a contraction. He says, Jimpa says, is left implicit. How are we doing? This is a little bit complicated section. You could just read it through it and think, oh, there's nothing being said here, but it's quite subtle and is the grist for the mill of a lot of debate. You know what I mean by grist for the mill? If you have a mill, if there's no stuff in there for the mill to crush, it doesn't do anything. But grist for the mill kind of means, like some object for your debate. There's a lot of material here. Okay, you think about it. If there's questions, we will continue next time, but let's go a little bit further. So that's a little bit difficult section, although it doesn't sound particularly difficult. Then the text continues, compassion that takes no reference as its object. So this is objectless compassion. Like when we talk about I've mentioned before the mantra of Chenrezig, make me say way. Ter Chen Chen Rezi, the first line, right? Mikme Sewe. Mikme Sewe. Sewa is a synonym of karuna, a synonym of compassion. So it's a mikme. That mikme means no reference or no referent object, no truly existent referent object. So compassion that takes no reference as its object, this third kind of compassion, also does not focus merely on sentient beings. It focuses specifically on sentient beings devoid of inherent existence. That doesn't mean that it realizes that they are empty of inherent existence, that they are devoid of inherent existence. Devoid and empty mean the same thing, right? Because then there would be two aspects. It still focuses on sentient beings, and its aspect is wanting them to be free of suffering. If it also simultaneously realized the aspect of them being empty of inherent existence, there would have to be two mental consciousnesses, which some people say can be, but here Lama Tsongkhapa is not saying that. Compassion that takes no reference as its object also does not focus merely on sentient beings. It focuses specifically on sentient beings devoid of inherent existence. So let me read what Jeffrey Hopkins translates that. Compassion observing the unapprehendable. So Jimpa says that takes no reference. Compassion observing the unapprehendable. That's kind of like mikme sewe. Also does not observe mere sentient beings. It observes a special object, sentient beings who are empty of inherent existence. Unapprehendable, or as Jimpa says, no reference, means not truly existent and refers to the referent objects not existing in the way that it is conceived to exist by a consciousness grasping at signs of inherent existence. Giving the name observing the unapprehendable or under unapprehendable compassion to the observations of sentient beings qualified by non-true existence is a contraction. So again, what it means is that it's not saying that you are realizing that the compassion is realizing that they are empty of inherent existence, but they're qualified by that. You've previous to this generation of compassion, you have a realization of emptiness of sentient beings that is still not degenerated in your mind. That is to say, you haven't forgotten about it completely. It's not affecting your mind. It is affecting that compassion so that the sentient beings are qualified by non-true existence. Richard, what do you think? You're thinking the classic Rodin statue there.
Did you say Richard?
I must not be understanding it because what's written on the page seems pretty clear to me. But I think that I think that this seems very, very clear to me that it's not qualified, that it's, sorry, let me just back up. It's hard for me to put it into words. But the main question that I have is how can the experience of realizing emptiness affect the mind so that it realizes the compassion? I'm not explaining it well. Let me.
No, I think so.
It's something that's brought up in the paper.
I gave an example, I think last week. Say, for instance, if you've been angry with someone,
Mm-hmm.
your neighbor did something, they put the fence closer, they extended their yard. It looks like their yard is bigger now. Your yard is smaller. You're angry at them. And so you have some anger. But then later, when you see them at the supermarket or something, you're not necessarily angry at them. But when you observe them, your mind is affected by that previous anger. And so you're not completely like, oh, hi, neighbor.
Right. That's what the paper calls cognitive penetration.
Oh, what paper?
The paper we just read.
Oh, kind of. Oh, okay, good. Okay.
And
Jeremy's paper,
and I think that the point that as I understand it, is that he said that there were some issues with exactly how the cognitive penetration works, and I have exactly the same questions. How does this work? What is
I don't know how that works. But and because that paper proposes these other kinds of solutions, that there are two consciousnesses and so forth, it's not something that myself can explain. But I'm just going by the fact that, for instance, here it says, in Jimpa's text, it says, in this way, taking sentient beings qualified by the lack of true existence as its object is referred to as compassion that takes no reference as its object, or as non-referential compassion with a modifier left implicit. In that he says qualified, he doesn't say directly qualified.
Right.
Directly qualified would mean that it is simultaneously, directly happening at the same time, manifest at the same time. Whereas Lama Tsongkhapa is not saying here at all in any of these sections that it is manifest, that realization of emptiness is manifest at that time. It's in the background, it's affecting you, or what did you say, cognitive penetration?
That's the term that he uses in the paper.
Yeah.
I didn't make it up. He made it up.
No, I agree. Yeah. So Jeremy was very happy that I was using his paper. So we talked about this a little bit. So that's his way of saying held by, or affected by, or qualified by cognitive penetration. So how that works, none of these great scholars have a convinced, according to them, they're convinced by their, they could be two consciousnesses or something, but it's not commonly accepted by everyone. Rachel, you have a thought?
Me? No.
Right, Rachel. Up in
I got confused when you said Richard. So
no, Rachel.
Rachel. There's a slight question about the difference in my mind between being designated upon a mere collection of aggregates and being merely labeled. So I know you're coming from
same words, label, designated, same, but the mirror, where the mirror comes, is different. When we talk about prasangika, we say merely labeled. Here it's talking about labeled on a mere collection, so a little bit different. So the implication from having realized subtle impermanence is that you realize that the person is a imputed phenomena, not a substantial phenomena. If those of you who followed earlier in Lorig, we talked about from the lower schools, there are two kinds of phenomena: substantial phenomena and designated phenomena. Say, for instance, a soldier would be a substantial phenomena for the lower tenets. That is to say, simply seeing the soldier by their presence appearing to you, you know the soldier. But an army is not a substantial phenomena. An army is a imputed phenomena or designated phenomena because it's imputed or designated to the collection of soldiers. You see, one soldier is substantial according to them because it appears as a soldier, but when you see a group of soldiers, the army, it doesn't appear in a substantial way as army. You have to designate that as army. Or let's say the example of a rosary or a garland of flowers. The same word in Sanskrit and Tibetan can refer to the rosary that you say your mantras on. It's a string of beads, or a garland, which there's a bunch of flowers that have been, one string you put around, like in when you arrive in Hawaii or wherever, or in Thailand or something, a garland is put around your neck. So for them, the lower schools, one flower is substantially existent. You see that, and by the force of it, it's appearing, flower. But you only know a garland by seeing the collection of parts, either the beads or the flowers, the string through them, and that you impute that, that name, rosary or garland, to them. So there are two kinds of phenomena. So here, when it's talking about imputed to the mere collection, it's talking about that kind of realization that phenomena are either substantial or imputed phenomena, according to the lower tenets. From the Prasangika point of view, all phenomena are imputed. Even the flower itself is imputed to its parts, its petals, the pistils, the pollen, and so forth, the stem. But according to the lower tenets, some phenomena, just by the force of their appearing, the substance of them appearing, one realizes them. Again, what do you think, Shankar? Are you paying attention?
Yeah, I mean, I remember that. And as you were mentioning about the lower tenets having substantial, the army and the soldiers,
right.
You could see how the Prasangikas would say there is no such thing, because of course the soldiers are collection as well, right?
Right, exactly. On their aggregates, right.
And same with the forest and the trees. I see the forest, and if the lower tenets say that, well, no, they're actually trees, then I could say, well, I guess there are actually leaves too,
Right, exactly. So that's the other example. So the army, rosary, and forest and trees. So one tree is said to be substantially existent. You see that according to the lower tenets. You see that, and by the force of its substance appearing, you realize tree. But seeing the collection of trees, you don't see a forest unless you see the whole collection and you impute the name forest upon that, so that a forest would be imputedly existent according to them. But as you point out well, for Prasangika, even the tree is imputedly existent upon its parts, the bark, the core, the leaves, the branches, and so forth. Okay, so a lot of subtle questions here. As the text continues, it's almost as though it doesn't pay any attention to some of those subtle points, because it's almost as though you were supposed to know this beforehand. The implication of these statements. Okay, let me continue. Compassion that takes no reference as its object also does not focus merely on sentient beings. It focuses specifically on sentient beings devoid of inherent intrinsic existence. No reference means no object of apprehension is clung to through the mind grasping at signs. Mind grasping at signs means signs of inherent existence. Thus, it refers to the absence of true existence. In this way, taking sentient beings qualified by lack of true existence as its object is referred to compassion that takes no reference as its object, or non-referential compassion with a modifier mere left implicit. So again, a crucial thing to notice here is that when he said, what did he say? Affected by, in this way, qualified by, he doesn't say directly qualified by. Qualified by lack of true existence implies that, or as who had said before, having read the text, Richard, the sort of, what was the term, Richard? Cognitive, you have to unmute.
Cognitive penetration, that one.
Cognitive penetration, yeah, as though, having realized it a moment previous or some moments previous, and that realization has not degenerated, that penetrates and affects the appearance of the sentient beings. You're not realizing that they're empty of inherent existence. So Lama Tsongkhapa says, many Tibetan commentators assert that the second compassion itself perceives sentient beings as disintegrating moment by moment. And the third compassion itself perceives beings as devoid of inherent intrinsic existence. These pronouncements betray a lack of correct understanding of the focal object, the referent object, versus the cognitive aspect, the aspect of these compassions. Both these compassions must be accepted as having a cognitive aspect or aspect, wishing sentient beings to be free of suffering. That's their aspect, all three of them. Well, in this case, talking about the two. Both of these compassions must be accepted as having a cognitive aspect, wishing sentient beings to be free of suffering. If, however, momentariness, subtle impermanence, and absence of intrinsic existence, emptiness of true existence, were asserted to be the objects of their cognitive aspects, a single instance of compassion would possess, insofar as its held objects are concerned, two dissimilar cognitive aspects. So we know from Low Rig that one consciousness cannot have two aspects. It only has one aspect. Or if you say two aspects, they have to be the same aspect, right? This said, it is the case that to take sentient beings qualified by these two characteristics as the focal object, that's your referent object, sentient beings qualified by impermanence or qualified by emptiness. Where did I go? This said, in the case, it is the case that to take sentient beings qualified by these two characteristics as a focal object, the person who possesses these two types of compassion within his or her mental continuum must first ascertain sentient beings to be momentary, first, beforehand, and must first ascertain them to be devoid of intrinsic existence, and on that basis have the aspects of these two facts appear to his mind, his or her mind. So having first, as I said before, not degenerated your realization of impermanence or emptiness of inherent existence, that affects your mind. It was a cognitive penetration, or generally what we say is zimpa. Zimpa means held by. In some of the texts that talk about two minds at the same time, we say ngusu zimpa. Ngusu means directly held. So Lama Tsongkhapa here never says directly held. It means that they're not manifest at the same time, the realization of emptiness and the compassion, or the realization of subtle impermanence and the compassion. They're not simultaneous. They're not manifest at the same time. On that basis, have aspects of these two facts appear to his mind. It is not that the compassion itself needs to perceive the beings in those two terms. What do you think? Tendra, Venerable Tendra, what do you think? Making sense? Yeah? You just, okay, that's enough. Okay. I thought you might have some comment. Okay. So, subtle points, but I think if you have a chance to read that article, you'll start to see some of the subtlety here. Sean, Ashley.
I was just going to ask, so when you say a focal object, like, so I can like look at this picture on my wall, is that my focal object, even though I'm seeing other things in the room that maybe aren't my focal object?
Right, it's sort of the one that you're referring to. There might be some peripheral vision, but like say, if I'm looking at this tanka here, I'm facing you, so I'm not looking at it. But if I look at that, that's my focal object. In my peripheral vision, there may be this blue board also there, or the brocade or something that's appearing to my consciousness. But what I'm focusing on is the painting part, the tanka. You could call tanka including the brocade, but by tanka, I mean the actual picture part, right? So that's your focal object. So in some cases, when the mind is more concentrated, it's more clear. Like say, for instance, when you focus on your own self of persons, your conventional self, that's your object of observation. And the aspect of that for an ordinary person is to grasp that as being inherently existent. That's called the view of the transitory collection, viewing your own conventional self and grasping it at it as being inherently existent. How could that be? If it's a conventionally existent self, how could you be grasping it at it as being inherently existent? Because the conventional self is merely designated upon the aggregates. The conventional self is not, it itself does not appear to be inherently existent. But as soon as you have an apprehension of the conventional self, simultaneous with that, superimposed on that, is its appearance as being inherently existent. So your referent object is actually, or focal object is actually the conventional person. And your aspect, the aspect of that view of the transitory collection is grasping it at it to be inherently existent because it's superimposed with the appearance of an inherently existent person. Your actual focal object or object of reference, or referent object, is the conventional person, but it makes sense, it's understandable that you grasp at it as being inherently existent because it's superimposed with the appearance of an inherently existent person. Stephen, that's your sign, that's your symbol of thinking, deep thinking, yeah. And making sense?
And so but they're saying you can only have one focal object at a time, right?
Right.
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 Okay.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the basic tenets of, in Dharmakirti's system of consciousness, that there's only one consciousness only has one focal object or referent object and one aspect. And even the mental factors that may be simultaneous with it also are also referring to the same focal object and the same aspect. So it is not that compassion itself needs to perceive the beings in those two terms. In both the root text, continuing in Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary, in both the root text and the commentary, that means Chandrakirti's auto-commentary to his karikas, to his root text, the two latter compassions are described as being qualified by the two characteristics referred to above. The two later compassions, compassion referring to phenomena and compassion observing the non-referential, or however you want to say it, objectless compassion, they are, I say, qualified by the two characteristics referred to above. It doesn't say directly qualified. It just means that like the cognitive penetration. While the first compassion is described as having sentient beings alone as its object, with no qualification. Nothing is penetrating your, cognitively penetrating your mind. With no qualifications by any of these characteristics. So the phrase compassion that takes sentient beings as its object also involves a truncation of the word alone for the sake of expressive concision. Thupten Jinpa is starting to write like philosophy professors. So Jeffrey Hopkins translates that section. In both the basic text and the commentary, auto-commentary, Chandrakirti explains that the latter two compassions observe sentient beings qualified by the qualities explained above, and says that mere sentient beings who are not so qualified are the objects of observation of the first compassion. Therefore, his giving the name compassion observing sentient beings to the first compassion is a convenient contraction. What Thupten Jinpa said, involves a truncation for the sake of expressive concision. It's just too complicated for me. The first compassion is a convenient contraction. Let's put it that way. Okay. Making sense? David? Okay. Snehi says, okay. In view of this, those who assert that the first compassion invariably takes as its object sentient beings characterized as permanent, unitary, and autonomous, as a permanent, partless, and independent. Remember, this was Paul's question earlier. In view of this, those who assert that the first compassion invariably takes as its object sentient beings characterized as permanent, partless, and independent are saying something untenable. That's not right. Mirik in Tibetan means, it's not right. It's untenable. Even with respect to compassion that arises in the hearts of those who have not found the view of selflessness. Okay, it means in the minds of those who have not realized the view of selflessness. On many occasions, it can arise simply on the basis of merely taking sentient beings as its object, without qualifying it in any terms. So that's what they're saying is, even though those who have not realized emptiness, it doesn't mean that everything that they apprehend is grasped as inherently existent. And on many occasions, it can arise simply on the basis of merely taking sentient beings as its object without qualifying it in any terms as being inherently existent, for instance. In the case of those who have found the common level view of selflessness or suchness as well, one finds within their mind streams many instances of compassion focused on sentient beings without qualifying them in either of the two ways mentioned above. So for those who've realized emptiness, also they don't always have objectless compassion. Either they're not, they have maybe previously realized emptiness, but it is not, there's the cognitive penetration is not working at that time. They're just observing sentient beings. They can have that kind of compassion. In the case of a Buddha, can a Buddha have the compassion observing mere sentient beings? What do you think, Jennifer?
I would say no, because they've already realized emptiness, and therefore, how can they observe mere sentient beings?
All right, interesting. So for the Buddha, the situation is different. For ordinary sentient beings, even a 10th level bodhisattva, they can have the first kind of compassion, observing mere sentient beings. But for a Buddha who is simultaneously realizes all phenomena, directly realizes all phenomena as empty of inherent existence, and directly realizes all phenomena as impermanent, subtle impermanence, the Buddha would not have that first kind of compassion, other than recognizing it in the minds of other sentient beings. He knows that kind of compassion because he knows the minds of sentient beings. So here's the thing that I was mentioning when Paul asked this question before. For example, with respect to someone who has eliminated the object of clinging, grasping at a vase as permanent, and has thus realized it as impermanent. So generally we have what's called permanent grasping. So when you see a vase, it is possible to grasp that vase as being permanent. Oh my, what is that? The Lord of the Rings. Oh my precious. What is it? The ring? Remember the ring? It's sort of like something really not only precious, but like permanent, For example, with respect to someone who has eliminated the object of clinging, grasping at a vase as permanent. So you've realized impermanence and has thus realized it as impermanent. There can still be many instances where he or she takes the vase as his focal object, but does not qualify it as impermanent. So even though you've realized impermanence, there can be instances when you don't, you focus on the vase, but you're not thinking of it as being impermanent. If you have that booklet, some of you who took the course before, Practice of Emptiness, you remember there were these different kinds of situations that were enumerated in that text, this same point. And likewise, in the case of those who have not realized the vase to be impermanent, every time they take a vase as their focal object, as a referent object, they need not do so by qualifying it in terms of being permanent. The same is true here as well. So even though they haven't realized subtle impermanence, they still have within their mind grasping at impermanence. It doesn't have to be manifest. You could just, like the example I said, you say, someone asks you, where's the book? You say, oh, it's over there. You don't necessarily have to think the book is truly existent or is permanent, even though you might still have those delusions in your mind. Making sense? Richard? No. Okay.
Yeah. If it's not making sense for me, because if you ask me where the book is and I say it's over there, that suggests to me that in some sense I have a feeling of permanence about the book, that I placed it over there and it's still there. And so my sense is that the book is permanent.
No, you're looking at it. You're not that, you say, it's over there. You might even look. Where's my Vajra and bell? Oh, it's over there. So it's not talking about, there are many examples within our minds when you have a consciousness that is not grasping at phenomena as being inherently existent, or not grasping at them as being permanent, even though those delusions, those types of grasping still exist as delusions, as faults in your consciousness. You can observe, that generally when we talk about later in the text, when Chandrakirti talks about conventional truth, how to say, there's examples about, and maybe this you may not see exactly how this is relevant right here. One might say, I gave birth to my son, the father saying, obviously the mother gave birth to the son, but it's as though planting the seed in mother's womb, one has, I created this son, or I planted this tree. Actually, you didn't plant the tree. You planted the seed that eventually became the tree, right? So in common parlance, we do talk about things like that. And in certain circumstances here, you're not always grasping at phenomena as being permanent. For the mind of an ordinary being who hasn't realized impermanence yet, you're not always grasping at them as permanent. And in our minds, even though we have not realized selflessness of persons, or we haven't realized emptiness, we're not always grasping at everything as being inherently existent. There's a lot of debate about that too, also, because in Arya Deva's text, the 400 stanzas, it says, just as the body consciousness pervades the whole body, the body faculty pervades the whole body. Likewise, ignorance pervades all our mind, as though ignorance is always manifest and present.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes people, in explaining that, they say also maybe because there's two consciousnesses, one that's always grasping at phenomena as inherently existent, and one that is, let's say, your Hershey bar or whatever, your nice, what's a nice kind of chocolate? Anyone have Bark Thins chocolate? Anyone know that one? No one? Oh, David has, okay. Oh, Tendrin also. So very good. One friend, when I was in retreat, brought me this bag of Bark Thins. Oh, so fast chocolate, little pieces of almond. And so if I'm apprehending that as attractive, like, ooh, I want that, I can't be at the same time apprehending it as inherently existent. They're two different aspects.
Okay.
But Arya Deva seemed to be saying it almost always present. So to be always present, there would have to be two consciousnesses, right? One apprehending the Bark Thins as inherently existent, and one as there are delicious, or how attractive, or I want them, or whatever.
Yeah, I understand the point.
Okay.
I understand the point being made. Yeah.
Okay. So, and likewise, in the case of those who have not realized the vase to be impermanent, every time they take a vase as their focal object, they need not do so by qualifying it in terms of permanence. The same is true here as well. So this is an important point. These three types of compassion. So let me ask, Ron, what are the three kinds of compassion? We should say great compassion, three types of great compassion.
What are we talking about? The
Three
the compassion for sentient beings, the two types of suffering. Are we talking about that?
No, we're talking about compassion observing mere sentient beings, compassion observing phenomena. That means observing sentient beings is qualified by being impermanent or empty of self-supporting substantial existence, and the compassion observing the non-observable or objectless compassion. Those are the three kinds of compassion we're talking about. So these three types of compassion are all, regardless of which of the three focal objects they take. What is it? Regardless of which of the three types of focal, aren't their focal objects all the same? Sentient beings? Don, what do you think?
I wouldn't think so.
Don Isaacson? Are you're still muted?
What was the question again?
Aren't here it says these three types of compassion are all, regardless of which of the three focal objects they take. Sounds like there's three different focal objects. Aren't there focal objects sentient beings?
I believe they're all sentient beings, and then three have different qualities.
Yeah, they're qualified. So the focal objects mean one is mere sentient beings, one is sentient beings qualified by being impermanent, and the third one is sentient beings qualified by being empty of inherent existence. So that's what it means that when it says three focal objects. It's focal, in one sense, focal objects are all the same as sentient beings, but they're qualified in different ways. So these three types of compassion, regardless of which of the three focal objects they take, are all endowed with the cognitive aspect of wishing to protect all sentient beings from all forms of suffering. All sentient beings, all forms of suffering. In that sense, they are very different from the compassion of Shravakas and Pratika Buddhas. Oh boy, how are they different? What do you think, Paul? Very different, he says. Don't the Shravakas wish to free all sentient beings from all suffering?
They wish them to be free from all forms of suffering.
Yeah.
I don't know that they wish to free them. So.
What does it say here? Wishing to protect all sentient beings from all forms of suffering. You could read it that way, I think. Possible. When I say to protect all sentient beings, that sounds like taking personal responsibility. But so when you become an arhat, are you free from all suffering?
You are free from the afflictions, the artificial afflictions, but you're not free of the innate obstructions to omniscience. You're free from
It's
suffering.
generally the innate obstructions to omniscience are not generally characterized as suffering, right? So, for instance, if you become an arhat, you've abandoned suffering and the causes of suffering.
Right.
Right. So though sometimes you could, in some circumstances, consider now let's say the bodhisattvas do the bodhisattvas have compassion for the Shravaka Arhats and the Pratika Buddha Arhats?
I just remember reading this.
Do you know what I'm saying?
I think
Stephen, this is another mudra of Stephen. So this is some of it is there. So you would think the bodhisattvas have compassion for the Shravaka Arhats and Pratika Buddhas, but they are free of suffering, right? And the causes of suffering.
Right, so they don't. And in fact,
so if they did have compassion for them, it would have to you'd have to extend the sense of suffering to include the fact that the Hinayana Arhats still have the obstructions to omniscience. So they still have,
Yeah, or is it, don't they say that even though they've eliminated suffering and the causes of suffering, they still have the mental predispositions? What is it, the avarana?
They have, when you've developed, what's it called? When you've abandoned something from the root,
right?
You've abandoned the delusion and its imprint and its seeds.
Mm-hmm.
You haven't abandoned the imprints.
Mm-hmm.
The imprints are something even more subtle, which can cause the dualistic appearance and so forth. But you've abandoned the seeds of the delusions and the delusions.
Right.
You've abandoned the seeds in the sense that they're still there on your continuum, but they have become impotent so that they cannot give rise to those delusions any longer.
Right.
You can't give rise to anger, attachment, and even ignorance, grasping to inherent existence.
Mm.
But the seeds of those have been abandoned in the sense that they are impotent. They're still, it's not as though they are erased from your mind. And the remnants of that are kind of like the imprints of those that can still give rise to dualistic appearance and the obstructions to omniscience.
Right. Right.
Rachel, what are you thinking?
Well, I was just wondering if there's any other karmas that could be ripened that weren't just obstructions to omniscience, but that those
would
manifest as suffering, that those karmas would manifest as some sort of suffering.
So I say again, I can't see your face because there you are. Okay, say again.
So I was saying that I was wondering if besides the seeds and the imprints of the dualistic appearance and so on being eliminated, if there were any other imprints and karmas that could ripen from previous.
Well, Arhats haven't eliminated dualistic appearance at all. There's they haven't gotten that far at all. They've eliminated, they've abandoned suffering and the causes of suffering. So they still have on their mind stream karma to be born in different realms, but because they've abandoned the klesha, grasping, in the 12 links, there's nothing to cause those seeds to be born in the future as a human or an animal. And so they won't take rebirth they won't take, they're not under the control, they're not under the control of karma and delusion. But those arhats can be awakened by the Buddhas later, reminded of the fact that they have not achieved their final goal. And by making prayers, those arhats, once they've awakened from their nirvana, they can ripen those seeds that still exist to be born as a human, and they can take rebirth as a human, but not through craving, grasping, and becoming in the regular 12 links. Okay. So whether the bodhisattvas have compassion for the Shravaka arhats, I would like to think that they do, and that require. This is my own idea. I've talked to some Dharma friends about it, and it doesn't seem like this question is addressed in the texts, at least the ones that we've read. I'd like to think that it includes the obstructions to omniscience, that the bodhisattvas have compassion for the solitary realizers because they're still under the influence of self-cherishing thought and so forth. Anyway, it's something to think about. Snehi, you have thought.
Thank you, Venerable George. This sort of came up in our exploring Buddhism course, and again, Don made this point that even arhats, where you were saying that you expand your understanding of suffering, is that they still have these subtle seeds of self-cherishing, because they are arhats, but they haven't made or taken the vow to free all sentient beings. They've just taken the vow to free themselves. And that subtle self-cherishing is still, like, for the Buddhas, a form of suffering. I don't know how to put it, but
that's my point. It doesn't say that usually you don't see self-cherishing, say in the arhats who've abandoned suffering and the causes of suffering. That's what nirvana means, right? Generally, you don't say that they're self-cherishing thought, because they haven't eliminated almost any self-cherishing thought. They still have self-cherishing full blown, but that generally is not categorized as suffering. So when we talk about suffering and the causes of suffering, when we talk about the Four Noble Truths, the cause of the origination, the second truth, the origination of suffering or cause of suffering is klesha and karma. So they haven't eliminated, they have eliminated klesha. They've eliminated all the klesha, all the delusions. They still have sort of a self-cherishing attitude. So anyway, something to think about. I've gone over already, so I'm just going to address two more questions, and then we'll do a dedication. Let's get Sean first.
I just wanted to
change your name. You had Ashley up before. You changed to Sean.
Is the bodhisattva vow, though, not to attain Buddhahood as the means to free all sentient beings of suffering, and then with the added caveat of to help lead them to Buddhahood themselves? Because if you add that caveat at the end, then the arhats have not achieved Buddhahood, so they still need that compassion.
Well, they still need your attention. Whether if you define compassion as the desire to protect or free sentient beings from suffering, so that's the question. So you have to think about that. Richard.
Thank you, Venerable George. I'm sorry, but I'm still a little unclear on how this is very different from the compassion of Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, how it's endowed with a cognitive aspect, wishing to protect all sentient beings. I'm not sure I understand the difference.
So Paul pointed out here in this translation, it says, endowed with a cognitive aspect, wishing to protect all sentient beings from all forms of suffering. It doesn't say to free them. Let me see here. Where are we? These three compassions observe each has the aspect of wishing to protect all sentient, I'm reading from Jeffrey Hopkins, wishing to protect all sentient beings from all suffering. So it's similar to what Thupten Jinpa is translated. Therefore, they differ greatly from the compassion generated by hearers and solitary realizers. So I think the operative, just in reading that, the sense of protecting is more than just wishing them to be free. The Shravakas and solitary realizers wish all sentient beings to be free of sentient, but they don't of all suffering, but they don't have the wish to protect them. That means to actively bring that about. They wish them to be free. Like when we talk about the immeasurable compassion, immeasurable love, may all sentient beings be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. That's usually the immeasurable compassion. That's what the solitary realizer and Pratika Buddha arhats have. They don't have the great compassion that takes the burden of protecting sentient beings themselves.
I understand.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, a lot of things to think about, even though this section looked very simple. Let me just read one more sentence here so to complete this paragraph. When such a type of compassion is produced, one comes to generate the awakening mind aspiring, I will, by all means, Shinek in Tibetan, Shinekang, which kind of means, I don't know the Sanskrit, means kind of like, at any rate, whatever it takes, I will, by all means, whatever it takes, attain Buddhahood for the sake of all sentient beings. Okay, so that's if you Diana is like me that forget where we started. So I'm going to make a little note here. If you have the digital edition, you can actually highlight that section and make it a color so that you can find it in the future.
Venerable George, I don't know if you remember, but I sent you a PDF of the text. So
right, I could do that, but this one I can put notes in.
Okay.
The digital edition, I can put notes, and I have Jeffrey Hopkins, and some next time we'll talk about some other texts. So thank you very much. Let's do a little dedication without the formal prayers, because we're a little bit over. Please sit comfortably. Try to recall the clear light nature of your mind. Let go of thoughts. And within that clarity, recall that at the beginning, we made a motivation to participate in the class today with the intention that that activity become the cause of our achieving enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings, right? We're collecting merit, wisdom, and so forth. We've created virtuous karma today because of that motivation and because of the momentary motivations as we were progressing through the teaching, thinking. Just by the force of the holy dharma, thinking about the holy dharma, just from the sight of the object, we've created virtuous karma. Think in whatever way this ripens in the future, may it not become the cause of ensnaring me in cyclic existence. For instance, having practiced morality, one can be born very attractive in the future as a karmic result of that. But if you hadn't dedicated the merits of practicing morality, your beauty in the future might be the cause of your own, pride and putting down others and so forth, this sense of superiority and so forth. In whatever way these virtuous actions ripen, may they become the cause of my continued spiritual development, developing renunciation, compassion, bodhicitta, and the right view of emptiness, up to and including my achievement of enlightenment from which position I can spontaneously, effortlessly, and without error lead all sentient beings both out of suffering and place them in the everlasting bliss of enlightenment. May these merits ripen in such a fashion. So this goes beyond prayer. Prayer is just when you wish something to happen in the future. Here we're dedicating the merits. We're trying to link up these merits with their eventual maturation, that they mature in such a way that these goals are brought about. So thank you very much. Good to see you all again, and hopefully see you again next week. Tammy and Morgan asks, changes of time. I think it's not until the end of October or something that we have a week off, right? But anyway, that's still several weeks. We have again class next week. And if you haven't received the text that I suggested that you read, you can find it on the Facebook page, or you can email one of us and we'll send it to you. So hope to see you again next week.
Thank you, Venerable George.
Thank you, Venerable George.
Thanks for your patience.
Thank you, Venerable George.
Hey, Venerable.
Good George.
Thank you.